Evening, it's 5 o'clock, special council meeting, City of Marshfield, Tuesday, April 22nd. Call to order, roll call. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Council orientation, presentation by City Attorney.
Easier probably up the podium and everybody can see me a little bit better. We don't really have but one member new, right? Is that right? Okay, so I mean, many of you have heard some of this stuff before. Some of it is going to be generalized. And I want to make sure that everybody feels, I'm going to do this loosely enough that if somebody's got a question about something in particular, we can hopefully talk about it in the meantime. But there's some things I think we can clean up, and I've kind of discussed, it may make sense to have some of these kinds of orientations more than once, just because there are issues that pop up. But, you know, the obvious reason that we're doing this is to sort of just acclimate new members and to sort of just talk a little bit about the general organization. And one of the things that I don't think I've ever really spoke about before, but one of the challenges we have is, you know, obviously this is a government entity, right? We're a municipality. But that's also a municipal corporation. And I think it would help all of you to understand that we are operating really like a corporation, in that the corporation has sort of its own identity. The city does stuff as a city, okay? And you guys are kind of like the board of directors. You have authority to pass, make motions, vote for things that become both city policy, and more than that, laws that regulate what happens here at the city. But in the backdrop of that, we're just not, and sometimes where this comes in is that a lot of people think, well, we're just doing what's in the public's interest. And I do this at a lot of different municipalities. I don't run into this. I think things are run really well here. I'm telling you that because I probably represent 7 other municipalities at different levels. And we do a very good job here. I mean, I wish others ran as good as we do here. But one of the things that sometimes gets missed is that, you know, we're not just doing the public will. We, at the end of the day, have an obligation to think about the corporation, because while it might be in the interest of the public that we spend all of our money on one particular thing, part of your duty is to make sure that the corporation is also running. So we don't blow all of our money on whatever it might be, good streets or good public health or whatever it might be. The corporation has to continue on into the future. And so many times I get this kind of, this is what the public wants. That's not really how we operate. And that, as we go through some of the materials here, you'll see how that kind of plays into some of the things that happen. And one of those then becomes my role as city attorney. It's a complicated role. And actually, in terms of practicing law, it's one of the hardest because I have multiple clients all at one time. Technically speaking, you all are a client. This code and state statute talks a little bit about what the duties of a city attorney are. And our code in particular basically says that one of my jobs is to give each and every one of you legal advice. Now, some of you that have been on here, and also it'll be 9 of you, have been on here long enough to know that you don't always agree. I mean, and if you don't always agree, then that makes my job in terms of advising people difficult, because sometimes I get a call from somebody who says, I don't like what's happening and I want to try to stop it. And my job then is to sort of discuss that as a goal. But I may get a call 5 minutes later that says, so-and-so is trying to do this to stop us from passing this ordinance, and what can I do to stop them? And so here I have this overriding obligation to give it legal advice, good legal advice, to both parties that are looking for a different outcome. And for the most part, I do that, okay? I have an obligation. Look, we in the city here went through some pretty rough times. If you wind the clock back 3 years ago, it was crazy the different calls I got in a given day over, agendas that various people had. And I see more of that, I think, too, that just kind of fell out of politics as they unraveled over the last few years. But the bottom line is, I got to try to do that. And you guys have to feel comfortable speaking with me that when you're talking to me, you trust what I'm saying. I don't have a political agenda. I hope I've done a good job trying to separate those things. And that you can trust that, I'm not trying to take sides on those kind of things. And that's sometimes where you guys get frustrated because you're looking for, an answer for something in a particular way. And I can't give it to you that way because it's not my job to make decisions. You hear me say that very often because sometimes there's elements that are in front of you that talk about even the economics. And I'll often say, it's not for me to decide the economics. Is this a good deal or a bad deal? That's not for me to decide at all. While I might have an opinion, I forbid myself to express that opinion as much as I can because that's not my role. And as soon as I start doing that, then I become part of the political process. That's not my role here. So I try to separate that out. The one thing that you need to keep in mind, and I've probably told this to some of you, when you call me up, going back to that organization, the fact that we are essentially a company that's running here. The number one duty that I have at the end of the day, though, is to protect that corporation. The principal core of this being the municipality as a entity for itself. And so where that comes in is that if you call me up and you say, hey, I got a problem, and my problem is that I've got an ethical question or, I got a problem, I did something wrong, and what can you help me? I can help you out to a point, but when that becomes obvious that now what you've done or are going to do is going to harm the corporation, then at that point, I can no longer provide you that confidential advice like you would go to a private attorney and be able to expect. Because if you came to me and told me, you know what, I've been slipping behind the door here, taking money out of petty cash for the last 3 weeks, and I'm trying to figure out what I want, where can I put that so that they're not going to find that? Okay, I can't give you that advice. Not only can I give you that advice, I'm likely going to be required under my other obligations to tell the corporation to stop what amounts to damage being done to the corporation. And those things for people who aren't lawyers and don't have to do it, it's kind of hard to understand some of that. But again, normally when you're on the phone, and I've had to do this more than once, I'll go over that saying, you're about to cross the line where I'm not sure I can give you confidence that I'm not going to have to disclose this in some way if I'm asked about it. So in any event, those are complicated issues, but I want you to be thinking about it because sometimes that can happen. We have had to deal with it, and it's sort of the expectation that comes out of my office. But otherwise, the code basically says you can call me up as a lawyer that's going to give you advice in your official capacity to carry out the goals that you have. And sometimes those are political, all right? They may be because you want an ordinance to go through or you don't think something's going right, and that's your prerogative. And I do have an obligation to help you try to do that. One of the things that this was kind of Jess's fault, so these are kind of not that fun, but she did want me to talk a little bit about Robert's rules. One of those things, and so you guys have had, a lot of you that have been on here, you've bumped up against these one way or the other. Jen, you maybe haven't, maybe you've done some things in the some type of body where Robert's rules have been applied. By code, we use Robert's rules, but what the purpose of Robert's rules is, where they came from, was basically to allow organizations, large organizations, to have a productive meeting through a procedure so that they could get things done. And that's the general purpose of it. And yes, Robert's rules are in our code. And I sometimes get this that, hey, are we doing that correctly or we're not doing that correctly? I should say it that way. And we had a meeting and you didn't particularly bring that up. I am obligated to act as an advisor regarding Robert's rules. However, I do not actively interfere with your procedure here unless I think it's going to truly affect something. And most importantly, that for some reason, that procedure is so out of whack that it would affect it legally. Because otherwise, if we're operating here smoothly, right, and this is my view of this, If we're operating here smoothly and we're not having a disorganized meeting and we're getting things done, I don't want to nitpick some specific rule if it's not necessary. One example is very frequently, heck, years ago, this was more common, but we just say, we're going to take a break. All right, we don't vote on it. And theoretically, well, motion should be made to do that. Or we've also had it at times where not formal motions are taken to convene. And it's done, basically everybody just gives an eye and we go out, but it isn't done quite as formally. Those kinds of things, it's clear what's happened. It's not going to interfere with the end outcome is. And for the most part, unless somebody calls out a question, right, procedurally, I'm not going to try to interfere with that. But those things that Jessica mentioned, one is don't do negative motions. I brought that up here a few times, right? So what happens if you've got, nothing happens unless you guys vote on it. So if you have an issue in front of you, I'll use again this simple thing that we've got an ordinance number 555, and it's in front of you and a motion is made to pass it, and a vote's taken and it fails, it's failed. Nobody needs to, nor should they take a motion to say, I move that we defeat that motion, all right? Something in the negative. There's reasons for that, because then the question is, when you vote that something shouldn't pass and that fails, then does that mean that it did pass? And it starts to become confusing for that reason. So we try to avoid the negative motions, and you are making the statement, right, about those things. If number one, let's say ordinance 555 is in front of you and nobody makes a motion at all to pass it, it's clear what you did. You didn't pass it. If somebody votes and nobody seconds it, it's clear what you did. You didn't pass it. If somebody votes and they second it and now it's in front of you and you vote and it ends up being 4-6, we know what you meant to do with that. It didn't pass. And so it's not necessary to take some other motion to defeat it. Now, that gets us to one of the ones that Jessica flagged, and that is you can make a motion for something and not vote for it, okay? In other words, your purpose in this situation is sort of kind of the same objective you would do if you did a negative motion. So you vote for ordinance 555, but you hate it. And you know tonight there's not going to be support enough for it, so you want it on the table. And that's fine. You can do that. And when the vote comes, you can vote against it. And that's fine. What you can't do, though, if you do it under Robert's rules, is advocate against it. If you vote for something, you're not supposed to advocate against it. And I don't know that we've ever had that happen here. Maybe there is a reason we were trying to focus on that one. Maybe it does happen. But just so you know, that's one of the things. The other thing that we run into occasionally, but Lois has been doing a great job with this, and that is, we used to have this come up all the time, but somebody who's sitting on a chair, and this applies not just to you here in this room, but some of you will probably chair other committees and commissions and such. But if you are going to speak on something, you should surrender the gavel. I mean, that is part of Robert's rules. And the reason for that should be obvious, right? If you're controlling the meeting and then you speak on it, now there's an inherent appearance that you've got a conflict in that matter, because you control now how long you speak, right? I mean, when Lois is up there and she decides somebody's only going to speak for 5 minutes, if she holds onto the gavel and starts to speak, there's no real way for anyone to stop her then, unless we have some kind of a uprising about order and those sorts of things. So we have done that. There are times when we break that, okay? And it's one of those things that's a classic example. I should have used probably more so as an example where I just sit quietly unless I really see an issue. Sometimes the thing that's being done with is silly, okay? So let's say, for example, when I'm, again, ordinance 555, we're all talking about it, but Lois says, well, you referenced the wrong date on it, okay? So she's speaking on it, she's talking about it, but she's just clarifying a piece of fact related to it. Honestly, I think you guys would be pretty upset if I said, wait, stop, shut the meeting down, switch out so she can tell what date this came up. So we don't do that, and it's a classic example of not following that rule because, look, it's not a matter of order, it's just an element that okay, we were a little bit out of procedure, but it isn't going to have any effect on anything and nobody's harmed by it. The other thing is, in Robert's rules, we haven't had this come up, but let's say, for example, that someone is speaking. We had some interesting matters being discussed over the last couple of meetings where the chair might just say, I'm not going to hear that anymore, right? I mean, it's possible for the chair to say, well, you spoke on this matter, and I'm not going to let you speak any further in regard to that. And the chair does have the authority to do that. There is an option for a member of the body to then challenge that, and the body ultimately does have the control over that. So let's say, for example, that's what happened. The chair cuts off discussion on a particular matter because it's determined by the chair that they've been speaking too long and or you've already spoke twice and I'm not going to let you speak a third time. The body could move, second, and vote on the question of whether or not that's going to be allowed or not. So there is a way that the body can correct a ruling from the chair by going through a procedure to do that. And when you think about it, many things like that can be handled here that way. And then another one we have here is just the question of making a motion before discussion, and generally that is a rule. Okay, so if a matter is in front of the body and there's the ordinance or whatever, and we know we've got the ordinance in the packet, and the question is, okay, what's going to happen? Before discussion starts up about that ordinance, it should be moved, seconded, and then the discussion takes place. There's an exception to that, and that exception actually does appear in Roberts, where the whole purpose of it is sort of discussion. And we have that at times where it's up to the discretion of the council. Something might be on there, and it might be just a very vague question, sort of, you know, do we like the way something's going or whatever, and it's council discretion. So that discussion can take place without a motion being on the table. It's spelled out right in the agenda that that's sort of contemplated, and Roberts does make an exception for those things to happen. I'm going to move into, we have public comment period. We've discussed that here amongst the body in terms of how to limit it and not limit it and all those different things. We've gone through that. I mean, the purpose of that is to allow the public input. They aren't entitled to it. But the one thing that you guys, and this is terribly frustrating, I understand for you, sometimes we got people in here yelling at you, might even pick one particular person out and say, they mistreated me. Yeah, it's perfect. So, you know, they might pick somebody out and say, I don't like what they said, and I feel like they're being biased, et cetera. And there's such a compelling urge to respond. And, but unfortunately, we are required under open meetings law to only talk about those things that are specified on the agenda. And so when an issue comes up, even though it's brought up, you know, in the context of the meeting by a public comment, the public generally doesn't know that one of the council members is going to address it, or all of the council members for that matter. So that's the reason why we just got to shut up during public comment. And sometimes we make that clear so that we can somewhat defend you in regard to those things, so that, you know, somebody isn't here saying, well, I said all those things, you never responded to it, so you obviously admitted to it. That's what it feels like. But the rules don't allow us to do that, and the rules don't allow us to do that because of the open meetings law. And the same thing, the mayor can make comments, but this is where we get into some trouble, and I've had discussions with Steve about this, okay? So I had even suggested at one point that we really address these sort of as announcements. It's okay when we have this general reference to mayor comments, administrator comments, comments by the common council. We have these things on the agenda. But if you think about it, if that just means you can comment on everything, then what's the point? We've already, you know, the open meetings law doesn't matter anymore because you can just bring anything up and have it during your comment period. And so that's a problem. So what is the real intent behind those? It should really be those kinds of things that are not up for comment, up for discussion, I should say. They're the kinds of things that you guys have really, for the most part, always abided by. I have it from time to time, try to cut those off when they get a little bit out of hand. But the kind of thing where you're announcing, let's recognize so-and-so. Or there's going to be a meeting down at the tennis courts to discuss, you know, opening the park at a certain time. It's an announcement that's good for the public to have, and you're doing it, but there's not really any action contemplated arising out of it whatsoever, and there's no real discussion even to be to be had over that so that it doesn't have anything to do with the common council business. Strictly speaking, this is one of those things that you're right on the edge of, how, whatever that discussion is, you could be in a problem under open meetings if there's a discussion that goes on that. So I just want you to think about that anytime that you're in there and you're deciding to make a comment. If it has to do with business, meaning the business of the city that might come up for discussion later, that is an issue on an agenda later in the meeting or an agenda in a later meeting to be had, you're really out of line bringing that up. And hopefully we catch that and maybe stop it if it gets brought up. But everyone's looking at me. I'm thinking you understand that, but I'm going to open it up right now. Is there anybody that doesn't understand what I'm talking about in regard to that? Okay, perfect.
Well, let's just do an example. So one time I did a council comment about how the utility dividend would change. So that I don't think that ever came as a future agenda, but it technically would come under a budget meeting, but it was sort of an announcement.
Yeah, so you don't really want me to tell you that you violated the open meetings law when you, right? Don't even answer that, okay? So here's the answer to that, right? You're right on it to the point where that's very close to a problem, okay? And remember, Lois isn't going to see that coming, and that's nothing against you, Lois, but this is some complicated stuff. I got to be paying attention and catch that to try to cut it off if you bring it up. But it's a great example because the answer is I would prefer not to do that. And if what you want to do is talk about something like that, right, or just to make that announcement, a great way to do it is to say, hey, let's put this on a future agenda. You even have the opportunity, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here, but you have the opportunity even to, kind of put that on the table perhaps before the meeting to get it on the agenda. Again, there was no discussion about that one. You were making an announcement of something that had been basically handled in another meeting, which was public. So, but my answer to that is truly, I would prefer not to have us do that. Only because here's the thing, you may be only wanting to make that announcement, right? But then if you make that and someone follows up on it, now we have an even bigger door open and it becomes a question. Do I think we get sued over that? No, I don't. Do I think it really ends up, it would be an unintentional violation? But it's the kind of thing that we try to avoid doing. And it's one of those things that I had a considerable debate with Steve some time ago about how much of these do we open this agenda up for the comments by the Common Council, by the administrator, et cetera? Because if we know those things are coming up, there's really a very hard time for us to justify not just putting it on the agenda to say we're going to discuss about the dividend, or we're going to make a comment or an announcement about the dividend, and that would be so easy to do. And that's ultimately how the public meetings law talks about that sort of thing. If you know something's coming up, then, just put it on the agenda. That's how simple it should be. All right, well, same thing, there is a reference here to reports from committees, but you understand how that works. And the reports from committees, those are usually okay because the reports from the committees often relate to specific action that's been taken. And if committees are slated to be discussing here, then we know what they're going to be talking about. So, however, is there a potential for a report from the committee to go overboard and be a problem? Yeah, it is. Because again, we don't have specifics about what they're going to discuss. And when they're doing that and a council member would want to comment back on it, they're not really in a position to do that because now we're having a meeting on that report. And if nobody knows what that specific report is, we're over the board. We've crossed that line where it's an open meetings concern, let's put it that way. Now, I want to talk a little bit because we've dealt with this many times. And at the last meeting, some of you sort of were surprised by how this was intended to work, Rebecca. But that's it. I keep picking on you because now I have the microphone. So we have on the agenda items for future agendas, okay? And this is something I used a long time ago, many years ago, because there was a lot of dispute going on about who got to pick what was going to be on an agenda. And there were requests that certain things would be on an agenda, and then the way the code read, I think that it was the mayor that could control it at the time. And then, so we were going through a real issue over that. And when you think about it, right, if you really want to control the outcome of a matter, if you control the agenda, you control all of it, because if it's never put on the agenda, well, it never gets there, so nobody does anything. So I had gone through this with Stephen. Again, this is many years ago, almost more than I want to think about that I've been here. But the plan was that we put these things as items for future agenda with a specific procedure involved. Now, we've never had this actually happen, and that was what Rebecca was surprised about last week when we talked about it. And here's what the purpose of that is. If somebody moves to put something, when we have this discussion, say, I want a review of the Board of Public Works makeup on the next agenda. We don't usually do anything when that happens. Nobody says anything. It's just, okay, we're putting it on. However, the purpose of this being put as a specific agenda item on the agenda is to allow you folks actually to weigh in on that. So let's say that somebody said, for example, that we want to put, I move that that on the next agenda, I want to discuss whether or not we should hang the Nazi flag at the back of the room while we're having meetings. The body could, at that point, somebody could say, I don't want that on the agenda. And that can be put up then for discussion at the next meeting. That's the reason it's put on there that way. So in other words, if somebody brings something up that everybody here says, we've talked about that 1 million times and it shouldn't be on the agenda. Again, this is ridiculous. And I've heard some people talk about that. Or because, hey, I don't even want that discussion on the record for whatever reason. And again, I use something that, somebody might look at as racist or something like that, that we don't even want to have a discussion on it. So a member of this body could say, okay, so-and-so moved to put that we should discuss putting a Nazi flag in the room. I move that we not put that on the agenda. And then what would happen is at the next meeting, you'd have on the agenda a discussion over whether that should be an agenda item. And somebody could just come in and say, I move that we never discuss that. And then you guys can vote on it, and you kill that from being an item for discussion. And that was the purpose of it, was really to create a way for things to be controlled on the agenda, where they weren't just controlled either by the mayor or by the administrator or whatever. A lot of things are put on the agenda when they're being made up by the administrator, and there's no problem with it. Nobody usually questions that, and there is some latitude in the code for that. But the idea was that we didn't want political matters to be controlled purely by the chair or one particular person, and let this body actually have an opportunity to do it. And it gives you that perfect forum to do the thing that I'm talking about, where, what do you mean? This is the 13th time that same thing came up. It could be a development agreement. It could be whatever it might be, but that you guys could say, I don't want that on the next agenda, so I want to discuss that whether it should ever be on an agenda. All right, well, anyway, I think that's one of those things that is a tool that maybe people didn't fully understand what the purpose of that was. Another one, and this was something that had been, I don't think we've ever talked about this in orientation meeting very well before, if at all, but it's the staff-council relationship, okay? And I don't mean that in a general sense. I think that's got to occur organically, okay? So when somebody's up here, they're talking to you or whatever, however you guys relate to them, that's fine. That's a different situation. What I'm talking about is, we go back to that organization that I talked about, and if you think about this being like a corporation and you guys are the board of directors, in your individual capacity, you really have no real authority. You do have that one authority that I told you that you can call me up as a council member and I got to treat you like my client, okay? But other than that, when you go to staff, you couldn't, for example, tell Jessica, now this probably happens, right? But I want to look at the personnel files. I'll use, actually, this is a better example, right? And we've literally had these kinds of things happen. But you go to Sarah and you say, I want to look at all the personnel files for everybody working in the engineering department. Officially, you have no real authority to do that. And there, you know, I've been here for probably longer than almost everybody here, but you have authority. And my experience over the many years that I've been here is that everyone in this departments, okay, in the city, as far as an organization, respect you for the role that you play. In some respects, they may fear you for the role that you play. And when you ask those things, they almost invariably try to do it. But what we need to be very careful about is that you don't have the power to do that, okay? And so this is one of those kind of friction points. Like if you think about it like driving a stick shift, right? You got the clutch. Where is that right place where you can, as a council member, come in and say to staff, I want you to do this, okay? And we get those kinds of things a lot. And like I say, what I see is probably more than anything, them accommodating this beyond what they maybe should, certainly more than what they have to. And I think that's all good because we want to keep the relationships up. But what I want you to be considering about sometimes, is it fair? All right, so that are you putting undue pressure? And examples of that would be, and we deal with this occasionally, I have probably more so recently raised the question when we've got a meeting going on, and I'll say, you know, wait a minute, we're talking about, I'll use for example, a contract. And we're talking about the contract, and some people like it, some people hate it. Probably more so it's in between, and we're right on the cusp of getting it by, and then somebody says, and I think we should make them move the crosswalk on 5th Street if they're gonna do this, all right? So we've talked about the thing, we've banged it out, everybody's kind of given an idea, and we're gonna be voting on this, and then somebody throws in that last idea, and what you need to realize when you do that is you're just one voice. We didn't vote on that. Some people might agree with it. Heck, this has happened when we know some people definitely disagree with it. And the problem is ultimately staff doesn't really know where that fits. Oftentimes they walk away with the impression that, well, we're gonna do what one particular member wanted to do because they said it. Maybe there's some logic behind that if nobody objects to it. And I want you to think about that when you're up here making these decisions, because it might make things work more smoothly. Because if you hear somebody say something that you definitely don't agree with, then that's a good time to mention that you don't really like that, so that we aren't trying to incorporate something into a contract that we're going to go try to get signed, and yet when we get back with it, it's going to have a clause in there that only one member supported. But this is more of a problem, obviously, when you take it outside of this room, when these discussions are happening, and you get somebody back in the engineering department and they say, this is a great idea or whatever, but do you think that we can line the streets with green paint? I would really love to see that. That's a problem because I 100% understand and respect your role, okay? It always amazes me every time we get 10 people in here wanting to do this. But you don't you put a lot of pressure on members of the city, employees, when they're kind of faced with trying to appease or satisfy one member for something, and they walk away believing that they should do that, but struggling with whether they can or should do it. I don't get those calls. I only see this. And just so you understand, I probably see that 5-6 times a year where somebody is doing something and they're doing it and they say, well, a council member asked me to do it. And it's like, well, okay, but I mean, are you spending a lot of time doing something that body isn't going to support? And then, how does that come about? The only real way to change that, affect that, and I know absolutely without any question, all 10 of you are concerned about blowing dollars for this organization that are unnecessary. So I want you to think about that when you're doing that. Am I asking for something from a staff member that might waste a lot of money and or time that ultimately is not going to pass, or at least might not pass, and then we've done something that's burned up that time? And then the other thing that comes out of that, and I've seen this, again, and I'm not talking about necessarily the 10 people that are in the chairs here today, obviously not one of them, but I have seen it over the years where then what happens is one of these employees who've gone out and decided to get green paint or try to find the cost of green paint or whatever it might be. And then when the matter comes up before the body and green paint is said, what are you, nuts? Green paint? That person is highly frustrated at that point. And so they've just blown a lot of time doing something that they, were doing, believing they should because somebody supported it, but it was a waste. And just those are things to really think about. Honestly, again, I love the city here and the makeup. This is a great organization. I work in others where this is just a frightening mess, okay? Enough that, I just really couldn't even explain to you. So in other communities, that's a real problem. Mayors calling up and saying, what the heck, I got stopped by the police and, all those kinds of things. We don't really see that happening here. But that is one of the elements to be thinking about, that your role is one of 10 to make decisions. And so, part of that process does mean that you have to inform yourself and maybe work with staff or whatever. Always keep in mind that what you say has an impact. So when you suggest something or whatever, it may be compelling them to go and do things that maybe you don't even intend in some instances. I know as I started working and had employees and everything, I've always been surprised that you change your whole entire life out because I mentioned that maybe, something wasn't working right. You sometimes have a bigger influence than what you really expect. And I think every one of you have respect from the employees here, and it means something when you say something to them. But anyway, that's definitely a factor to be considered. And, as an aside, we're missing some staff, obviously, and there's been trouble fulfilling it. And that's not just unique to Marshfield, but how that relationship goes and what the interactions are, those influence so much with keeping employees and being able to bring employees in. And so that goes a long way to having an understanding of what that relationship is. All right, there's a reference here to open meetings law. We've been dealing with that for a long time. I know I've been up here and spoke about it several times. We do have conversations about walking quorums. Walking quorums really references where we don't actually have a meeting, okay? So where this sometimes comes up is everybody meets down at the park incidentally because we're having the 4th of July parade or something like that. And so you got more than a quorum there. And so it wasn't intended as a meeting, but all of a sudden you're now talking amongst yourselves for 4 of you. That's, that could create a walking quorum depending on the subject matter. And then the idea of a negative quorum. And a negative quorum, again, can be walking, meaning that you don't intend to have that meeting, or it can be chain mailed, okay? And what I mean by that, so when you talk about a walking quorum, there's a classic case where what happens is somebody sends an email and says, I really hate Ordinance 555, and I think that we should make sure that we got enough people to defeat it. And you send it off to 7 of the council members. And then you get a response back from 2 of them saying, I'm in, I'll vote it down, as long as Mike O'Reilly votes it down. And then Mike O'Reilly fires off an email and says, I don't like it that much. I guess I'll join in on that. What you've now done is voted on that matter inadvertently, not intending to do it, but all of a sudden when you get enough to actually pass that legislation, then you have essentially engaged in a walking quorum to even discuss it. You don't have to decide how you're going to vote on it, but you've discussed the matter that is going to be on the next agenda or whatever. It becomes a negative quorum when what you're really doing is talking about enough people to defeat it, okay? So in that instance, in a normal matter before this body, 5 members would be theoretically enough to defeat the legislation. So if you have an email chain of 5 people talking about a subject matter that's going to be on the agenda, you basically have engaged in a walking quorum that was enough to defeat it. So that's a negative quorum, right? That becomes even that much more complicated when you consider the fact that certain resolutions, budget resolutions, require 2/3 of the body. So now those numbers start to dwindle. And here's where it gets even more tricky. Some of you, again, are going to be on committees or commissions. I'll use the Judiciary and Licensing Committee. There's only 3 of you on that. That means that 2 of you talking about something that's going to be on that agenda has now been a negative quorum if you discuss what's going to be discussed in that upcoming agenda. So those are the ones that are real, you're not thinking along those lines, or how easy it would be to cross that line on those types of committee. I've got down here too to make sure that we stick in, and this was really discussed, and that's just that, remember, when you have an agenda and it's on a particular item, there's some latitude if a matter is related to that original item, but as soon as we get off the topic that's been noticed, you're outside the open meetings law if you start talking about something that's so peripherally related that you're now talking about an item that was not noticed on the agenda. We try to catch those things as discussions are going. We probably are a little bit more aware of that. One of the great things I think we've lucked out with here is Jessica has just, she's kind of new to this, and I've always, when things are coming up, I always look to her because she's just had recent training. And I feel like, okay, I can rely on, what's her reaction to this? Is this going okay? And then occasionally I get up and say, well, what do you think of it? But in any event, we want to try to stay on the agenda. And I think most of the time here in this body, we're going to catch that. But it's on these other committees and that where it would be potentially easy to have that happen, particularly when we start talking about some of those other committees and commissions where we may not even have members of this body or only one member of this body, and you start dealing with citizens who are not thinking along these lines or open meetings or have had very limited interaction with that. There's a reference, and you guys have dealt, I think, enough with the closed session and what constitutes a closed session, and that there's only limited reasons we can go into closed sessions. One of the things I want to make sure we cover, especially for new member, is the idea of your public record. And so because you're a public official, you are obligated to maintain your own public records. So if you're sending out emails and it's on your, personal PC at home or a tablet or phone or whatever it is, and if you have an obligation to maintain that, if it has any of these communications and or records include things that you might receive that you're relying on to make decisions, those you are obligated to maintain, and you could personally get an open records request. So most of the time when we get open records requests, they come to probably Jessica, and then they're asking, occasionally it might be then for council member so-and-so's records. Technically, that request is in error because it should be made directly to the council member, but we usually don't play that game, and we gather up that stuff, and you get a call from Jessica to ask for it. But the bottom line is when those requests come in, you have an obligation to have those, okay? What makes this a little bit more complicated then is that sometimes some of you may have a Facebook page or something that you're engaging in that relates to comments that you make related to city business in your capacity as a member of this body or a member of, again, it could be a subcommittee. But when you do that, that Facebook page then is essentially a public record that needs to be made. So if all of a sudden, and this is what typically happens, right, is that somebody then starts making negative comments on your Facebook page and you want to just shut it down. You may be able to shut it down, but what you do need to do is keep record of it as long as you're in public office. So that's important. It's one of those things. It's great to have the contact with the public. I understand that. You may want to do that, but there is responsibility then that comes from doing that. And then this gets into another element that is, how much time do I have? I got 10 more minutes. That's great. Okay, so I only need another hour past that and it won't be a problem. So one of the things, and I've mentioned this just within the last week, remember that you wear multiple hats, okay? And what I mean by that is you obviously wear a private citizen hat. That's how you got elected, right? I mean, so you have a right to have an opinion about all kinds of things, and you're frankly about everything in your capacity as a private citizen. What you need to be careful about is there are times when you make comments that you may be wearing both hats, or it becomes confusing which hat you're wearing. And that's something to consider when you're making comments. So as an example, right, when you maybe make an entry on social media and you say, I'm a member of the Common Council and I think this, that becomes confusing. Are you saying that as a member of the Common Council? Frankly, in some respects, and I'll try to address this, probably doesn't matter. But that perception of what that means is an issue, okay? Because as I discussed before, you're only one of the members of the board of directors in theory, so you don't really get to say what the city is doing, thinking, or acting on. You can only do that collectively. So while you can give your opinion as a council member, you're not really giving your opinion as a city, and that's where the confusion often comes in. And I cannot tell you how often those complaints then get circulated to the administrator and then eventually to me, and it's that so-and-so said this, and it's like, well, yeah, they're a council member, but they're not speaking for the city. The question of whether it was accurate or not becomes a factor in all of this, meaning that, you know, if somebody says, well, that's not what was discussed, or that's not how it's supposed to be. For the most part, it isn't going to matter because you're still speaking in your own capacity as a member of the body, not as the body as a whole. But these things, when they happen, do create reactions from people. So I want you to think about that and think about when you make your communications, sometimes it may be helpful to spell that out or be careful about that. I realize that sounded confusing. Is there anybody that doesn't understand what I'm getting at? Okay. You're shaking your head, you don't understand. Oh, okay. Well, you should. Oh, I'm just kidding. All right. Well, anyway, I just want to be careful about that because it probably would take away some of those things where people are coming in. I am absolutely, what I'm sure about is this. I know there are members in this body, probably everyone except for Jen, who has sat on the other end of that. All right. And what I mean by that is you sat there and you saw a member of the body say something and you're like, how could they say that? It's because they're talking for the council and we don't feel that way. And you've been perplexed by the fact that another member of this body would say something in a particular way that sounds like the whole body feels that way. And that's been a source of frustration. So keep it in mind whenever you're doing something so we don't cross that line or it becomes a difficult matter of perception. But more importantly, one of the reasons to be aware of that is because what you don't want to do is misrepresent the level of authority that you have. And I mean that by you're a member of the body, but you can't really speak for the body. So if you go on to, WDLB and say, well, you know what, the Common Council will never let that business come into town. You didn't have the authority to say that. You couldn't speak for the whole entire Common Council. It might be easy for you to even say that because you're a member of the body and you know how everybody feels, but you shouldn't be making a representation that goes beyond the scope of your actual authority as a member of this body. That's the key to what I'm talking about, because it's the one thing where, we start getting into trouble. It also could imply that there's been some kind of discussion that nobody even knows about, right? Some kind of secret decision that was made that was never part of a meeting. So again, reasons why not to be doing that. Now, boy, one of the things I have down here is ethics, and we all know that that's a very long discussion. We could probably have a whole evening on that. The general thing is, first of all, you can go to the ethics code, which is, well, actually it's an ethics policy. I'm going to mention that specifically because it's helpful. I don't know to what extent anyone's actually taken the time to look at this or find it, but it's kind of an interesting thing to get a hold of. You have to go on the web page and then go to the Department of Human Resources and then look up policies and procedures. And then when you open up the policies and procedures, you get to 3.340, and that's the ethical standards that apply to public officials. And those primarily involve conflicts of interest. There are some statutory references there, which also, for the most part, address conflicts of interest. And I'm not going to go into the full details of that, but I'm going to let you think about it in two different ways. Essentially, there's regulations that say that you can't engage in a conflict of interest by doing something in your official capacity. So what that means is you have a contract with the city to provide beekeeping services, and now you're on this body and you're going to vote on the contract that you actually have, then that's a conflict of interest. You're acting in your official capacity over something that you're going to get a financial benefit of. It's clearly in our code that that's not okay. And that would be the same if it was a family member, husband, wife, whatever, that would be part of that contract. So it's not yours, but it's your husband's or your child's contract to keep bees for the city, and you're voting on it. That's a conflict of interest. That's in your official capacity. The other version of that is that you do something in your private capacity that would interfere with your authority as a council member. So that would be sort of like entering into this contract, even though you're not actually going to be presiding over it as making a decision over whether to enter into it. But it would be entering into a contract that would somehow interfere with the duties or doing something with respect to your private capacity that would prohibit you from then engaging in the duties you have to carry out your obligations as a member of the body or as a public official. So it can happen either way, and that's something to be aware of. The other one, and we've talked about this a few times, and again, I don't want to get dragged down into the nuts and bolts of this, but there is a statute, a criminal statute, that basically says you cannot have a private interest in a public contract, okay? And that's one that can be kind of difficult because it's not a matter that you can avoid it by not actually participating in the decision-making about it. If you reach a certain threshold of $15,000 in an annual period, you just violated the law, even though you may not have taken any action related to that contract. Again, we could spend a whole lot of time on these various ethical questions. And, at some point, maybe we consider having a second session or bring in other members of the other bodies and committees that would have to deal with these particular issues. I'm pretty close now, and I just want to make sure, are there any questions, something that somebody wants to have addressed that we've just got the table open for right now? Oh, somebody from the crowd. Judge.
For those of you who don't know, I'm Jared. Could you address moving forms, bodies, on top of the going down without ever getting before 6 people like
Sure. I mean, again, that is the walking quorum issue, and that is that if you discuss something that is going to be decided or would be a potential decision of this body, and you have a group that's sufficient to either, again, like I said, it doesn't just have to be enough to pass legislation, but enough to stop legislation, then that's a walking quorum. There's case law that talks about this. It's happened in the context, and frankly, I've dealt with it in a couple different times where there, in fact, were violations, not necessarily here, other communities, by email. Okay, that we don't see that one coming. That's so if you send off an email, and you guys have, actually, everybody except for Jen's probably got this from me. Whatever you do, don't respond to that. I send out an email just saying, don't respond to that. So when we send a blanket email and everybody in the council gets it, if we start responding back to that, we can piecemeal in, daisy chain an answer to a particular or discuss a particular matter, even though it hasn't been noticed as a meeting, and that's the same thing. So if you, for example, wanted to defeat some legislation and you send an email and then the next person, 4 people get it and you have an interchange, as soon as you've got enough that people have responded back to it, then and I'm going to use it this way very carefully because that issue is actually very complicated in terms of whether you've crossed the line for an actual open meetings violation, but you definitely, as soon as you do that, have exposed yourself to a claim that that's what happened. What's important in that context, if you look at the case law, is that if you have this sort of exchange where multiple members of the body, enough to block the legislation and meet a negative quorum, one of the things is if you guys are talking about your favorite flavor of ice cream, it's not a problem. It's that it has to be an issue that would be in front of this body. And presumably, normally, it involves an issue that's going to be in front of the body or maybe already is on an agenda. That's where this becomes a smoking gun. You've had a discussion about something and you already talked about what everybody's feelings are about it, you've basically violated the open meetings because you've had a meeting on it without announcing it. There is some case law out there that actually makes this complicated because they say, well, it is possible for members of a body to basically count votes without crossing the line over whether or not there's been an open meetings violation. But you're so close to one when you do that, you're exposing the city to liability. Those things shouldn't happen. The same kind of thing can happen if you meet, and this is the classic over at Nuts Deep, after one of the meetings. I've been at one or two of them where everybody kind of goes on and all of a sudden you got 4 or 5 of you there. Technically, that's not a violation, but it sure looks like one. So then we get the calls saying, hey, what the heck? The council member went, and then I heard him talking about something or whatever it might be. As soon as you've got enough that you could meet a negative quorum, you're going to be exposed to a question. But an open meetings violation doesn't happen until you actually talk about business that would be in front of the body at that point. Did that cover what you were looking for, Judge? Okay. So that's definitely, and remember, the trap is varied because of our new technology. So text messages, killer. Email, killer, right? I mean, and obviously phone can do the same dang thing. And then what happens, and we've been here for this, the wake of open records requests that we get in those things are just absolutely crazy. And they then involve your personal equipment. I see you on the edge of your seat. Does that mean I'm done? All right, well, thank you guys for your attention.
And who would like to vote to adjourn the meeting? Motion by Alderman Warman, second by Alderman Tompkins. Please vote to adjourn the meeting.
Mr. Varsho?
Yes.
And Mr. Rigel?
Aye.
The meeting is adjourned and we will start the next